Millenary Petition. Protestantism had been established in England by this time. But Protestantism had remained very, very formal and liturgical because it contained many Roman Catholic carryovers. And as a result, and this for some reason kind of seems to tie into our earlier message in the intertestamental period, you have a division in the church, the Protestant church in England. You have two different groups of people. You have those who are comfortable with the status quo and who just desire that the formal, and thank God it's Protestant, they would say, liturgical church is alive and it was good enough for our forefathers and it's good enough for us. Those are called the Anglicans. You have another group of people, the church, the Protestant church in England, who are not very excited with what they're seeing in the church. They don't think that Protestantism is as different as it could be from Roman Catholicism. These people are known as the Puritans. The Puritans did not want to separate from the church. They were not separatists. They were Puritans. They wanted to purify the existing one. Now when they later, and this will not really be a part of our study because it will concern American Puritanism, but when they later saw that their actions of purification were simply unreasonable and impossible as far as the Church of England was concerned, they then became separatists and they sailed to the New World. That, of course, is a study for American church history and not for the King James Version of the Bible. So we'll stay with the Puritans as they are in England. Now, they're a very important minority group that arose and came to some type of prominence during the reign of Elizabeth I. After Elizabeth died, and this is generally true in all governments, they saw King James coming to the throne as a prime time to ask for certain changes. Whenever you have a so-called passing of the guard in the government, then that's as good a time as any to try to institute some new plans or some new programs or try to pass your ideas off on the other people. They've been waiting for this for some time. Elizabeth was just not going to bend for them. The church in England is a very stately liturgical church, and it is down to this day. They have their cathedrals there that are Protestant cathedrals, just like we have many of the ancient RC cathedrals in the other parts of Europe, continental Europe, and not in the British Isles. Now, what they decide to do, the Puritans, is band together under some highly educated, well-known leaders of theirs. They have their own colleges and their own leaders and their own groups and churches and so forth, and present to the king this legendary petition, the Millenary Petition. They do so as the king travels from Edinburgh to London in April of 1603. Now remember that James has been king in Scotland for, 36, 37 years. James VI. Now he becomes king in England, James I, and he's a 36, 37-year-old man. They assume that they're going to be able to change his mind and what he wants to do. Here's a picture of James. Sorry I didn't bring one for Elizabeth earlier, but we're going to spend a lot more time with James. But someone, at least one person, has asked me for a picture of James. I don't know if he looks like an FOG to you or not, but he was. I think he has the resemblance of one as far as I'm concerned, but this is what he looks like. And of course, whenever they would sit for an official portrait, there were no Polaroids then. There were artists and painters that did it. You'd be at your best then. So that's probably why you don't see his tongue in this picture. And neither is any fool on his beard that I can see. But they would generally be at their best then. So the king travels from Edinburgh in Scotland to London in April we could figure out, what anniversary we just passed of this great event here, although it doesn't really fit because we're not on a 3-year, but a 7 one. In April of 1603, they presented to him the Millenary Petition, so called because supposedly 1,000 ministers signed it. Comes from the Latin, like millennium, which means 1,000. That prefix, mil, means 1,000. So there's the origin of its name, the Millenary Petition, so called because 1,000 ministers supposedly signed it. Now, just an interesting side note, I was able to dig up in a mine somewhere, some stuffy mine. The 1,000 ministers represented 1/10 of the English clergy. And the 1,000 ministers, of course, represented the Puritan cause. So that's a rather large number of Puritan ministers and Puritan people. In other words, 1/10 of the people must have had Puritan sympathies. 1,000 ministers, and that, from what I can see, is about 1/10 of the English clergy. That's how many ministers there were in England at the time of King James, about 10,000 ministers. There were probably only a few million people here, so 10,000 ministers is a fairly large number. Now, the petition was very diplomatic in that they spoke, quote, neither as factious men nor as schismatics, end of quote, but simply complained of their, quote, common burden of human rites and ceremonies. That clues you in immediately to what some of their complaints are then. Their common burden of human rites, R-I-T-E-S, of human rites and ceremonies. In other words, Protestantism, they would have argued, could be more different than it is from Roman Catholicism. It just hasn't changed enough. And I would agree with them 100-fold. If I would have been living in their day, I would have been a Puritan. A charismatic one, but I would have been a Puritan. Then I would have sailed for the New World too, I'm sure, because you can't purify the old church. But we all probably try to purify our church. I know I stayed there for about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months, I can't remember, but my philosophy was, my view was, well, I'm not going to leave my church, this church that baptized me, christened me, nurtured me, and fed me cookies in Sunday school all these years. Surely I owe them something. So I'll share my experience, but we know that doesn't go very far. Look how often that's been practiced. I mean, anytime a charismatic tells you, bloom where you're planted, say, go read Puritan history. That's been tried many times before. And the purifiers never work. The separatists, the restorationists, the reformists are the ones that will work. If anyone will work, those will be the ones that work. So they said, we come neither as factious men nor as schismatics, but simply we complain of, quote, the common burden of human rites and ceremonies. So, remember we're talking about what was the impetus, what gave the rise to the King James Bible. I mean, this book that I'm holding right here that you have before you, what gave this its origin, this petition? What was this petition all about? It's a Puritan petition addressed to the new king. They thought, now's the time we can get some changes in England. They're not asking for a new Bible. They're asking for relief from common burden of human rites and ceremonies. They think now's the time to ask for it. We're going to ask for it under this new king. And hopefully with a changing of the guard, then we'll have a changing of some policies as well. And so it came about as a reaction against Protestants who just didn't carry their Protestantism far enough. And we would say the same thing. I just never cease to be amazed how you can look in the Protestant church in America today in general and find Roman Catholic doctrine everywhere. And the Lutheran church, to me, is no different than the Roman Catholic church. And you can go to some other forms of it. You can go to even Baptists, and they're still referring to the apostles that wrote the New Testament epistles as St. Paul and St. Peter and St. Jude, and well, where'd you get all those names? But those are carryovers right out from the bondage of Roman Catholicism. So their argument is a valid one as far as I'm concerned, and probably 1,000-fold more in that day than in our day, that the church, you Protestants, you are not protesting enough. I mean, you're not even following your own name. You're not protesting enough these rites and ceremonies of common burden that are just weighing us down. So, the Puritans asked for moderate reforms. Now, you know whenever you go in and ask your boss for a raise, you don't just say, give me the sky. You ask for a moderate one. If you get that, then you ask him for more. So they're asking for moderate reforms here. Not an introduction of full Puritan doctrine and program. They know that that would never go. So the scheme is to always at least try to get your foot in the door before you get yourself in. They're not asking because it would never pass. They're outnumbered 9-1 here. Let's just change the church in England to a Puritan church. Just a few moderate reforms. What were some of their specific grievances? Let me just list a dozen, and there are more. But I'll list a dozen of the Puritan grievances which gave rise to the 1,000 ministers signing this petition, hence its name, the Millenary Petition. Here are some of their very specific historical grievances. Number one, see if you would have a grievance with any of these. Corrupt church courts. Well, you might not be that familiar. We don't have a lot of church courts around, but you know, all the bribes and corruption that you would have there. Number two, you would be familiar with this, reading lessons from the Apocrypha. Puritans are already alerted to this. It is not Scripture. I find it so interesting how denominational leaders today just talk so much about, you know, Lutheran heritage and Presbyterian, and you have to have someone like Marty over at the University of Chicago write a book on the Puritans in their own land and give us some American historical background for the Puritan people. Because if you look around, or if you look in a phone directory, look under churches and look under P, you will find First Puritan Church there. What happened to those Puritan people? Well, it just doesn't seem like people who want to stay with the Bible last very long. Either people drive them out and away, or what happened with the Puritans, they're kind of incorporated into mainline denominations. Or, of course, they could escape into some other groups like Brethren. I'm sure some of that did happen. Number three, the length of the service. Now, we might not agree with Puritans here. They didn't like those long services. But I guess we would agree we wouldn't want the long services and nothing but a lot of bondage and corruption. There's just too many ceremonies of this going on and that going on. It reads like the Southern Baptist Convention of the 20th century. The Puritans wanted short services, but they wanted services that were dominated by the preaching of the Word. The Anglican Church did not have a service dominated by that. Another grievance, number four, confirmation. They felt that was not biblical. Confirmation, they felt, was not scriptural. Number five, giving a ring in marriage. Giving a ring in marriage, they felt, came from paganism and was not necessary for a Christian. What are you looking at me like that for? I'll have my share whenever that time comes. Well, I've got mine on tonight, so no one will be suspicious about anything. There have been times, as maybe some of you have noticed, that I did not have it on, but somebody did notice. We'll say more about that later. Sabbath breaking. Puritans were the ones who really gave us all of our blue laws here in this country. They were very up on keeping the Sabbath. You can even read some secular writings from American history and you'll just find little asides, generally in the form of negative remarks made against the Puritan people and, for breaking a Sabbath. Whew. I mean, we've never seen a corporal punishment on a child like the Puritans could level for Sabbath breaking. And that would include things like telling a joke on the Sabbath. You were not to laugh on that day. That was a holy day. So surely they had their own religious problems. Well, the grievance of theirs was the keeping of too many holy days. Too much to remember on your calendar. try to send all of your relatives birthday cards and anniversary cards, and you wish someone would do away with all of those things.
Amen.
Or just give them one whenever they're born and say, I'm glad that you're born. I'm not going to tell you every year that I'm glad that you're born. One of those is enough. We're glad that you got born one day.
Amen.
We try to keep up with them sometimes, and sometimes we don't remember them. And then people hold that against you. And we thought the way out of that was to tell them, well, you don't have to send us anything. You won't offend us at all. You can send it a month later. It won't offend me at all. But then they won't let you out of it that way. It still offends them. Even if they don't have to send you anything, they still, with their little greedy selves, want something from you. I know it doesn't bother me. I don't care if you get the call a month later or a year late. Wishing you your happy 18th birthday and you're 37. Doesn't make any difference at all. Some of ours have probably ended up down there about like that. That's why people are upset. Well, I don't sense that we're having any great problem with that right now, but I just thought I would throw that in for free. Less liturgical music is another thing. They wanted less of all that racket in church. But not the praise. That was okay, but that had to be done quietly. So again, they had their problem, but they don't want all of the liturgical music, all of the Gregorian chants, like a bunch of savages in a modern country. Another grievance of theirs, these are all specific by name, was baptism by women. They were opposed to baptism by women. Another grievance, bowing at Jesus' name in communion. Bowing at Jesus' name during the communion. This was just a part of the liturgy of the Church of England. Whenever the name of Jesus was mentioned in whatever their ceremony was, and during communion, then everyone would have to bow. And the Puritans, they didn't mind bowing to Jesus' name, but they just didn't feel that was right. That's too mechanical to have this little thing where we all kneel down before his name. That's just wrong to do that. They didn't have problems with Philippians 2 and the bowing of the knee to Christ. So you see what they're saying. I would have a problem with that too. When you make it into a ritual or a formula that we have to bow in his name every time, that's not right. And then another, what am I on, number 11? Well, I got close to a dozen anyway. Display of the cross at baptism. Which was a carryover from Catholicism. Whether an actual cross or crucifix or the sign of the cross. They don't like that. They don't think that that's right or necessary. Now notice, or did you notice already, no reference to a Bible. That was not a grievance of theirs. Here are their grievances. Here are some of the things they want changed. You can tell very clearly they want the liturgical nature and composition of the Church of England somewhat modified. They're not asking for a total introduction of Puritan doctrine, but somehow, some form of modification in the Church of England. Therefore, the Puritan clergy suggested that a, quote, conference among the learned, unquote, be held to settle the problems of the parties of the Church, small c, of England. King James agreed to their request. Thankfully he did, or we would not be studying his Bible or have his Bible. And he called for a conference, quote, for the hearing and for the determining of things pretended to be amiss in the church. Now that's such a famous reference, I just want you to get that down. For the hearing and for the determining of, and particularly this phrase, I almost named the message after this, things pretended to be amiss. Or even the next message on Sunday could easily go by this title, but no one will know what you're talking about, things pretended to be amiss. So I try to keep the titles on the tapes a little more historical, somehow more descriptive of the content of the message. for the hearing and for the determining of things pretended to be amiss in the church. Just a very famous statement during this day because of its connection to the eventuality of the King James Bible. Things pretended to be amiss. Now, it's a little ambiguous, as you can see. What does James really think now? Is this just a pretense? Is he kind of going along, but he's really not in agreement with what the Puritans are saying? Things pretended to be amiss? Well, we'll see as we go along what James's attitude is. He comes from a Roman Catholic background. Mary Stuart was his mother, remember. What his attitude was about this whole squabble between the Puritans and the Anglicans. But again, let me underscore that is the historical basis for the origin of the KJV. The squabble during this time between the Puritans and the Church of England. Although it's not over the Bible initially, it eventually works its way around to that in almost a fortuitous way. And then before you know it, some of the other things, like the grievances that I've just given you, are kind of dropped from the discussion and from memory, and everything and everyone focuses their attention on this Bible. Now, the last thing that I've just said, he desires and decides to call a conference. See how much of this I want to say and how much of it I want to save. Okay, we'll go ahead with it this far. He decides to call a conference at Hampton Court in southeast England. And we're going to have more to say about the actual conference itself. We're still kind of working our way up to that. But he decides to call a conference at Hampton, Hampton, two different words, Hampton Court. Hampton Court Conference in southeast England, just a little southwest of London on the Thames River. Here in the year 1515, about 100 years earlier, the famous Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, W-O-L-S-E-Y, built one of the largest royal residences in the world. 1,000-room rose-red brick edifice complete with twisted chimneys and topped with fantastic gargoyles. Now, it's a royal residence, I say. He was a cardinal because it was coveted by Henry VIII and given to him in 1526. It's known as Hampton Court. Built in 1515 by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, one of the largest royal residences ever built in the world. 1,000-room. Now, you've heard of an 8-bedroom house is a large house. 8-bedroom house is a large house. This is a 1,000-room house. Well, it's a castle, of course. Rose-red brick edifice, complete with twisted chimneys and topped with stone gargoyles. Coveted by Henry VIII and given to him by the cardinal in the year 1526. Wolsey himself was one of the most powerful religious figures in England during the days of Henry VIII. But he's really known by historians more as a statesman than as a cleric. Now, here is a picture of Hampton Court. Well, you can't see all of it, but you can see a little bit of it, and it's a rather dark photograph. I might could come up with another one, but I came up with this one hastily here. 1,000-room. It's just for one man. Think of the servants. You're going to have about 1,000 servants to keep something like this clean. 1,000-room mansion. Oops, sorry. It becomes a residence of Henry VIII in 1526. This is where the conference is held. Now, they've met him on the way in between Edinburgh and his trip to London, and they meet him on the way there in 1603 with his petition. Then he calls his conference. they want to call a conference among the learned. And I quote from their writings. And so that's exactly what he does. They've got to have somewhere to meet. I mean, we've got scores of men who are going to meet, so you can't meet in an 8-bedroom home. So they meet in Hampton Court, this 1,000-room rose red brick edifice. Now, an interesting historical tidbit, why did they meet in London? I mean, London's the capital. That's where they should be meeting. Surely there are many large buildings in London that could hold them. Well, at this time, 1604, the plague had just hit London. 30,000 people died. So the king moved away from the capital until the plague lifted. So that's why they didn't meet in London. If the plague had not hit about that time, surely they would have met there. But the bubonic plague struck. 30,000 people died. There's the place, Hampton Court, for the conference. The date. It opened on Monday morning, January the 16th, 1604, and lasted 4 days through the late afternoon of Thursday, January the 20th, 1604. We have precise details about a lot of these matters. Some things have been lost in some fires, though, but some of the men did take personal notes of this. Some of those have been lost in fire, but some of them survived down to this day. January the 16th, in other words, that's the date to remember. January the 16th, 1604, is when they meet early on a Monday morning. Now some details about their preparations. Instead of allowing the Puritans to pick their own delegates, James selected those that he wanted to represent the Puritans. Now, since he's new in England, he hardly knows the Puritans are, the people. Then he probably got his selections from members of the Church of England that he was, of course, much more in agreement with. James selected 4 of the Puritans. I'll give you their names and some things about them later, but he selected 4 of the Puritans to represent the Millenary Petition. 1,000 had signed it, he selects 4. They, in turn, had to face more than 50 established church leaders, including 9 bishops, and including John Whitgift, the old Archbishop of Canterbury. So you'll see his name as well as his successor, Bancroft. Those will be 2 names, especially Bancroft's name, that you will become, won't you, very familiar with as we go along. But remember Whitgift, just like it sounds, Whitgift. Good English name. And then his successor, Bancroft. We'll get to Bancroft later, it looks like. Archbishop, and then his successor is Archbishop of Canterbury. Now there's some of the preparations. Here are the odds then. 4 of the Puritan leaders against 50 Anglican leaders. And of those 50, 9 of them are bishops, and 1 of them is the Archbishop. That is the leader of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift. They said, that doesn't sound like very many people. That's 54 people, plus the king would make, 58? Just think if you were awake there, 55. Well, plus you weren't awake. Plus there were many hundreds of other guests that were invited. Because he also used this Hampton Court Conference as the inaugural conference for James as the new English king. So many people were invited, of course. They couldn't even fit in Hampton Court. They couldn't fit in the 1,000-room mansion. So they settled in tents in the lush gardens and deer park that surrounded the castle. Now you want to know something about the weather that day. All right, we've got that too. We're more reliable looking back a couple of hundred years than looking ahead tomorrow. I want to give you a very real picture so you feel like you're there and you can see. You look at this castle. You look at these twisted chimneys and fantastic stone gargoyles on top. More descriptions of what it looks like inside and what takes place. You saw what King James looked like, how they dressed. Who was there? Puritans, 4. Anglicans, 50. 9 bishops, 1 archbishop. The atmosphere, what's going on? They gave us this Bible of Bibles. The late days of December were very cold and foggy. And evidently that weather carried over into the first half of January. No one could enjoy either the tennis courts or the bowling alleys because these were outside. But they all did hunt, drink, dance, and eat until their hearts were content. I want to give you a very vivid picture so you know the origin of the Bible that you are holding. Now, on a day like this in England, inside that castle, it would have been very cold. The only way to heat it were, of course, fireplaces, or you could bring the charcoal pans over and set down near you, as we even see that back in the Old Testament in Jeremiah's book, and get some warmth. But it still would have been cold. The dank air must have been stale because there are no baths in the palace. 4,000 plus guests there. Hunting, drinking beer, dancing, and eating speaks of perspiration to me. So, what did they do? The servants sprayed perfumes everywhere in the air. Now, in those days, people took baths very rarely, like once every 3 or 4 or 5 months. I should have demonstrated that for you. I should have, 4 months ago. You probably would have put a sentry at the door and kept me out, though. But, we'll say more about that in Christian ethics, too. Maybe we're going to return to those primitive days of our ancestors. That is a recent practice of bathing every day or twice a day. I mean, so recent that I remember when I was a boy, we got one once a week. It was on Saturday night just before church on Sunday morning. And I don't remember having a problem. Maybe others did around me, but I never had a problem that week. We got one bath a week, though. It was late Saturday night. The whole crew of us, they'd toss us all in the tub. And it just basically, just from fighting around in the tub is how you got clean, you know. But this is when I was especially very small. I had 2 sisters, and we just all jumped in the tub together. And when you got through playing with your boats and ducks and trying to drown each other and practicing your backstroke, you were clean then. And we would get out and dry off and be ready for church the next morning. So this is not something unusual to be happening during this day. It was very rare for them to take a bath as often as we do. But, I mean, to be in this big castle with all of the hunting and the drinking and the carousing and the dancing and the storytelling and all that they would participate in, and the dank air of the castle itself, I mean, just, you don't have disinfectants and things, and you're really not that concerned about matters like that. And there are rats and things running around, and cold walls, there's mildew and mold everywhere. And you got all of these men in there perspiring. So the servants took care of it by spraying perfumes everywhere, and that's the way that people took care of their bodily problems in those days. Just spray perfume around the house. And Estee Lauder tells us that's the way women should put on perfume anyway. You never rub it on your wrist and do this and behind your ears. That's the gross caveman way to wear perfume. The only way, see, I know more about perfume than maybe you do. And this comes from Estee Lauder herself, the queen of the perfume ladies, so she ought to know. The way you put perfume on is you spray it in front of you and you walk into it. That gives you a perfect scent in. Now, I haven't tried it, so I'm not speaking from experience. But see, I've got to research all these matters if I'm going to be qualified to teach on them. And we will be teaching about those matters in Christian ethics, so I will have a lot of things to say. But that's not unusual. Estee Lauder doesn't have, she thinks she has something new, but that's been done down through history, the way you would clean yourself as you would spray the perfume in front of you and walk into it. Now, the king kept his hands from drying out by never washing them. You know what happened? Not even the washing of the hands. You know what happens in the wintertime when the air is different than it is in the summertime. You don't have the moisture in the air, and you take too many baths or too many showers, and your skin cracks and peels. I mean, that's the time to take as few as possible because you feel more comfortable then. Then you have the natural oils of your body keeping your body soothed and protected. So he kept even his hands out of the water because he didn't want to put his hands in the water, bring them out, and feel that dry and that cracked feeling. So he dipped them daily in oils and balms and things like that. So although the air was dank, it must have smelled very good around there because of 1,001 different perfumes and oils and balms all mixed together. As far as entertainment was concerned, Shakespeare's actors performed plays every day before the conference for a small fee plus a tip from James. There is much dancing and drinking, heavy eating in the main room of the palace on those cold, rainy, and foggy days. There was a little wild boar hunting on the side and a little fox hunting as well. The weather was conducive for that, but not for tennis or for bowling. Now, did you catch some of what I just said? There is a lot of heavy dancing and drinking and eating going on by all these men. And that includes the Puritans as well. Lots of beer guzzling then. And mark that down because that will come up again when we discuss some of these translators of the King James Bible particularly. And we'll see the stomach size of some of them, what it could hold, and what they put in their stomachs. And these are the men who gave us our Bible. Some were more saintly than others, I might add, just for the sake of those who were. But finally, after, you see, this is prior to this initial thing, actually getting into the conference. Finally, it's time to turn their attention toward the real reason for the calling of the conference, the things pretended to be amiss. And so what we have at the very beginning are a series of discussions between the bishops, the Puritan party, and in this we see the great deftness, D-E-F-T, the great deftness of King James to turn things around in his own favor and yet please two opposing parties at the same time. I'll make that note and we'll prove that and come back to that later. The great deftness of King James, in that he could turn a situation around to favor him while pleasing two opposing parties. Remember, he might not have had the best physical appearance, but he was very intelligent, very shrewd, very wise, intellectually capable man. Now, the Puritans were not even allowed to the conference on the first day, Monday. They had to come on Tuesday. Now, that shows right away where the favor of the king existed then. And when you don't even call the whole group representing the matter here in until the second day, that means you're in cahoots with the Anglicans, and you've already done your discussion of strategy on Monday then, and you invite the Puritans in on Tuesday. So the Puritans are not allowed in to present their case until Tuesday, and they do so through Thursday. Now, here are some of the people involved. First of all, let's discuss Puritans. These will be names that just will sail through your ears from now on until we finish this. So you won't even have to try to become familiar with them. Here's probably one of the greatest names we'll discuss, John Reynolds. Now, you see it spelled different ways. I'll give it to you one way and then the way that I prefer. R-A-I-N-O-L-D-S, Reynolds, John Reynolds, R-A-I-N-O-L-D-S. Or you see it the more regular way, Reynolds. Reynolds. That's the way that I'm going to spell it, although I've seen it both ways. I don't know which is correct. But if the first is correct, the second is certainly more contemporary, so we will bring it up to date. John Reynolds. John Reynolds is the father of the King James Version. That's how important he is in this whole matter. He's the father of the KJV, the Puritan president of Corpus Christi College at Oxford, and one of the most learned men of his day in all of England. The Puritans had their divines, their scholars, just as did the Anglicans. The father of the KJV, the Puritan president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford, and one of the most learned men in all of England of his day. Secondly, remember there are only 4 Puritan leaders. Secondly, Lawrence Chatterton. Lawrence Chatterton. Chatterton. Lawrence Chatterton. He was a Cambridge man. And we'll come back in much detail and discuss these men later. I'm just giving you a little bit about them. Reynolds is an Oxford man. Chatterton's a Cambridge man. Now, 2 other lesser figures who were to actually have either little or no part in the translation itself might also be mentioned here. First of all, Thomas Spark, still a Puritan, number 3. Thomas Spark, S-P-A-R-K-E, who had a little bit to do with the actual translation. Then another man who evidently had nothing to do with the actual translation, John Newstubbs. K-N-E-W, that type of new. K-N-E-W. S-T-U-B-S. Stubbs. John Newstubbs. Okay, we got 4 men here. And these are the 4 Puritans that I mentioned earlier by number. Here they are by name. John Reynolds, the father of the KJV and a very avid translator. I mean, he actually worked on the translation itself. Lawrence Chatterton, who actually worked on the Bible itself. These were the men that the king picked to represent the Puritan party. That doesn't guarantee they're going to do any work on the Bible, because we're not even talking about a Bible at this time. But as it works out, I'm saying, these 2 men do end up actually on the committees of translation. Thomas Spark does a little bit of work. We'll discuss what he does later. John Newstubbs, evidently, he did not have any role. Now let's go over to the Anglican side, or the bishop side, discuss just 2 of them. We've got 50 here. I'm not going to go through those, just the important ones. And there are 2. John Whitgift, the present Archbishop of Canterbury, who was soon to die, was too old to have any part in the work anyway. He'll die before we go very far now in our study, so you won't need to remember Whitgift's name very long. John Whitgift, the present Archbishop of Canterbury. And then secondly, probably the most important man now on this side, the Anglican side, his successor, Richard Bancroft, who at this time is Bishop of London, soon to be Archbishop of Canterbury. James's right-hand man as far as this conference and committee is concerned. Richard Bancroft. Now we won't discuss him as Archbishop yet because he's not. He's under and in the shadow of his predecessor, John Whitgift. But Whitgift is old. He's going to die here just a couple of years from now, and he'll pass off the scene. We won't even discuss him. Richard Bancroft is the important man. Bishop of London at this time, soon to become Archbishop of Canterbury. Those 2 men, along with 48 other Anglicans, along with the 4 Puritan leaders, all met in the king's private chamber, which was a large room that had been a part of King Henry VIII's state suite on the east side of the court. So we actually know the very room in which these men initially met. They met in the king's private chamber, which was a large room that had been part of Henry VIII's state suite on the east side of the court. James doesn't sit on a throne, but he sits elevated in front of the people, and they sit before him on two sides, just like a judge in a courtroom. Now, at age 37, James is really a very, very young man. As a matter of fact, with people like Whitgift and some other of the men that are certainly here, these men are old enough to be his father or grandfather. He's a very young man here. His son, 10-year-old Prince Henry, is sitting on a stool to the right of his father. James the First, who it is said stuttered something terribly. Again, that's probably due to that large horse's tongue in his mouth. By the way, has your husband been picking up better around the house this week? Good. I'm glad. That'll be $5 from each of the women. Well, now, if he doesn't pick up, tongues can grow larger in his mouth as well. James was a Slav, and he had a big tongue. Maybe it's one step to the next. Well, he stuttered. Maybe that was also because of the too large of a tongue in his mouth. He opened the second day, Tuesday morning, with a few words, and then the matter was turned over to the opposing parties. This then, the second day, Tuesday, began the actual work of the conference. The discussions then ensued between the Puritans and the Anglicans. And what they said will be our topic on Sunday morning.
Follow